Ryan, when did you find out about this story and think that of all the stories that went on in Guatemala, in Central America, in all of Latin America that could have paralleled this, why this one?
So I didn't know all of those stories. I'll be honest with you. This story found me as head of the documentary division for the Kenny Marshall Company. I work with Frank Marshall on a host of documentaries, and one day he came in to my office and said, "You got to hear this story." And it just so happens that Frank is lifelong friends and went to high school with Scott Greathead, who's the human rights attorney who ended up representing Oscar in his political asylum case. And so Scott made Frank aware of this amazing story of one of his clients. And it was right before Scott, Oscar, and Freddie Petrelli, the executive director of the Forensic Anthropology Foundation of Guatemala, were going to be coming to Los Angeles to go to the Riverside Federal Courthouse for the sentencing of one of these soldiers found living in Southern California as a U.S. resident. And so Frank encouraged me to grab my camera and join. And so I met all three of these men, drove out to Riverside with them, sat in the courtroom as Oscar read this prepared victim statement, did a little bit of filming before and after, and I came home to my wife that night and I said, I think I've just filmed the end to the most fascinating story I've ever heard, and I think I'm going to have to go to Guatemala. I knew after spending that day with Oscar that not only was this an amazing story, but here was what I thought and proved to be pretty close to the end. You know, this incredible tale of justice, seeking justice that starts in the jungles of Guatemala by these incredible human rights activists and anthropologists, and ends up decades later finding this boy, now a man, in the suburbs of Boston, of all places. And here he is now participating in that same justice. It's like, as documentarians, you're not often given your ending at the beginning. You often have to wait for life to evolve and see where the story's going to go. And at that point, it just seemed like this is where this story is going to end, and now we need to go find the rest of it.
And Stephen, perhaps you can talk about how you came to be involved in this project.
Actually, yeah, it was on the same visit that Freddie and Scott made to Riverside that they came. They knew about the project of the USC Shoah Foundation, and that Steven Spielberg had established this archive to take the testimonies of people who witnessed the Holocaust and now genocides other than the Holocaust. And so we had a conversation which also resulted in planning a trip to Guatemala, because the work that Freddie Pesciarelli was doing on the forensics was about finding evidence, but he was very aware that also there needed to be voice, and that many of these stories were not being told. So the story that was being told through their labs was that of forensic investigation that needed to be done to establish the crime itself. But that the people who had survived did not have voice at this point. And so actually we ended up on the same trip together. He was scouting with a camera, I was scouting with a camera, and we were at the bottom of the same excavation during an exhumation, one of which you saw a short clip of that Ryan included. And it was kind of in that moment where we were in the bottom of this grave with these two corpses that were being exhumed, with the family around the edge of it, that kind of combination of justice and truth-telling through investigation and the need to tell the story became really clear. And so actually, yeah, this is a really interesting moment, because out of the making of the film, and the process of making the film, we have now taken 350 testimonies of people who are the relatives of those, and are partnered with the forensic anthropology group there, and we've trained them to become oral historians so that when they take the evidence and exhume the evidence, they also now document the personal human story.
Ryan, last year, right here, there was a documentary screened about the Khmer Rouge killings in Cambodia. And it turns out that some of the people who were doing the killings still live in the same villages with people whose family members they murdered. And the code of silence endured and endured, and then it started to crack. And hearing their stories was just as compelling from that point of view as hearing the stories of the people who were victims or relative of the victims. So how did you get those stories out of the killers in this case?
Yeah, so I mean, we benefited from the fact that they had already broken that code of silence when they offered their testimony first to Orlena Farfan and then to Sarah Romero. And so they became, their testimony became the linchpin for this investigation, which made it different than any other investigation because this was not, this hadn't happened really in Guatemala, that certainly within the Caibiles, this elite special forces unit, that you had soldiers breaking the code of silence to come forward and say what really happened. So that testimony had already been documented both in the two trials that took place in Guatemala and has since been repurposed, reutilized for the two trials that have happened in the States. We also benefited from the fact that there was a ProPublica piece of journalism and a This American Life story that took place several years ago. And so this wasn't the first time they had shared their story, both in testimony and in journalistic endeavors. However, it was the first time that they were in front of a camera doing it. And for me, because I was well versed in what they had said previously, I had an idea of who I was going to be sitting across from. And it was an idea of somebody who had been involved with the most horrific of crimes and essentially was probably some iteration of evil. I'd never really done an interview like those two interviews. And so as I prepared to face somebody who, was involved with killing children, the minute both men walked in on the separate days that we interviewed them, I was reminded of the power of visual storytelling because I had heard their stories, I'd read their words, but seeing them reminded me that these were human beings. This wasn't some idea of that there is just good and evil in the world, that it is black and white. And we spoke to them and we got their story. We certainly got them to speak to what happened at the massacre, but we started at the beginning, much like the testimony that the Shoah Foundation gets from survivors. We started at the beginning to get a better understanding of what was the circumstance that brought them through their lives to find themselves that day involved with this. Because clearly something didn't sit right with them in that they had broken this code of silence to share this story. And in no way do I feel or do I want to rationalize their culpability away for what they were involved with. But just having that dialogue gave me an empathy and a desire to have a better understanding of how they became who they became and what they became involved with. Because I think if you don't understand that, or if you don't try to appreciate that they are just human beings with the potential for good and evil within them and within us, that's how we are, doomed to repeat this same cycle, regardless of what part of the world or ethnicity or skin color might be at play.
Please thank our guests for this important film.